Hello and welcome to the 29th episode of Radical Priorities. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
First thing to talk about today is telecommunications in Canada. It's a bunch of infrastructure across Canada that are controlled effectively by a monopoly, companies like Rogers and TELUS. And in recent months, because they have so much debt that goes back 20 years or more in some cases, back to when telecommunications companies were basically building all of the infrastructure that would become essential for the internet and social media and just now all the technology that we use. They have all of this debt, and they've been doing their best to basically sell off this debt in terms of so they'll take assets that they have, so huge significant chunks of the Canadian telecommunications infrastructure, and sell it effectively to American private equity firms, for instance, and they'll basically allow them to restructure their companies, their debt. But the end result is obviously that the Canadian society itself finds increased foreign ownership in our telecommunications infrastructure. The significance of this is sort of twofold. I mean, or there are two different ways, at least, of looking at this problem. One, on the one hand, you sort of have the objective account of how we got here, and many people will talk about kind of the slowing revenue growth to do with people. The population growth has subsided, and regulators have implemented pro-consumer policies. There's intensified competition between the telecommunications companies themselves, and this is sort of kind of a process of market maturation. That's one account. On the other side is sort of, again, the story of telecommunications itself. These companies were essential, as I said, to building the internet, and there was a big sort of market bubble that burst in 2000 and resulted in tons of bankruptcies and problems for the very telecommunications companies and other companies that had built much of the infrastructure that Facebook and in time Google and YouTube would end up using. And what that means is that basically part of our public infrastructure, if we can consider the digital world a piece of public infrastructure like a train or our energy infrastructure, one could reasonably argue that these telecommunications company built basically a public utility. And yet what's very difficult is how do you treat a public utility in a market that obviously involves private actors and, in a mass privatized economy. And this is sort of the issue that we see again and again, really, I would say, in parts of the Canadian economy, whether it's the postal service, whether it's our energy sector. And depending on which one you look at, one might be tending towards even more radical privatization, like obviously the fossil fuel industry. In the postal service, as we've discussed, it has no competitiveness. It can never be kind of a private company. And somewhere in the middle, you have this kind of monopolistic control by these telecommunications companies who find themselves at the present moment having to sell off vital pieces of Canadian infrastructure that are still private. Even if there's a monopoly, they're still private. And it introduces this big question of how do we acknowledge, in some sense, the contribution to something like digital infrastructure. We don't really have a framework for thinking about this kind of infrastructure, for contextualizing a public utility in the context of the internet. And in fact, like the global reality as far as the creation of these pieces of public infrastructure is concerned is huge tech companies that exert an enormous amount of influence, which our telecommunications companies don't really do to the same extent as the big tech companies. They're sort of fossils of an older kind of technology. Mainly, they've been a kind of cartel, unfortunately. But again, the answer to this is sort of unclear unless we figure out a framework, much like with our energy, much like with our postal service, for how to have nationally significant companies, operations, or pieces of infrastructure. Unless we have a framework for national significance, it will be we'll see more of this, more involvement of foreign ownership of our infrastructure. And anyway, that's the situation as it stands with telecommunications.
Sorry, what does it mean exactly when you say they sort of sell off pieces of the infrastructure to the American companies?
So basically, you can imagine that when you have, your phone signals and they connect to networks and towers, and it's this complicated spider's web of infrastructure.
Sure, yeah.
And they own it, which means they run and regulate it, and they get to charge us
Right.
for using their infrastructure. So when a company will sell a 49.9%, which is almost the most amount they can do without them properly restructuring their corporate governance. This is a way to get more capital. But again, it obviously is a very short-term solution, both for the companies and obviously for Canadian society.
Right. Well, this makes me wonder too about, the ongoing sort of large-scale infrastructure project that we have in Canada is one, energy, which is very different, right? Because the whole thing with energy is that it's basically so abundant that it just kind of makes the most sense for the government to run it. It's like there's just like an unbelievable supply of it, and so it's not really looking to be competitive as such. Like, it's not run in the same way. It's run closer to something like the postal service, which is kind of caught in this weird thing, I guess, between almost like telecommunications and just pure energy. But right now, what we're building in Canada is these huge AI farms, these massive, server GPU farms, which seem to be almost entirely. They're entirely private, right? We're basically selling off parcels of land to San Francisco-based companies, and to Googles and Facebooks and X's and things like that. Which again, the reason why they're building them here is because we have all that energy. We have basically so much fresh water, which is needed for cooling and all these operations. But again, it just seems like eventually that will follow the exact same model as these telecommunications companies. Is my understanding. I don't really see it as any different, even though we've seen people on all sides basically say, liberals and conservatives have both been like, this is the new wave. This is how we need to attract foreign investment into Canada. This is how we, use our natural resources, this thing that we have, this really lucky kind of bounty, and we attract foreign capital. But again, it seems super short term, and it seems like something that eventually we have no control over, and they basically just can't earn anything on without turning into these sort of weird versions of themselves, like well after the fact.
I think it's a great point. There is a sort of invading cartel, if you will, or monopoly. It's in terms of these AI companies or big tech companies already operating in Canada. The problem is they're almost going to be worse than a monopoly, right? A monopoly still exists within a fairly traditional economy, and in that sense, that's what we've had with these telecommunications pieces of infrastructure. What's so interesting is, again, that these telecommunications companies are this fossil of a kind of like failed attempt, a failed transition from, like, let's say, market society to internet society, whatever that means. But definitely, like, again, they had such an important role to play. It was a massive market effort, like, no question. It was a huge speculative effort. That's one of the rare moments where speculation has to be sort of looked at a little bit more admiringly, just as far as getting down the infrastructure for this crazy idea of what would become the modern internet, involved this belief that we're going to make so much money. And this, of course, was the tech bubble that burst in 2000. But the tech companies of today, which are also, they're double natured, right? They're fossils. Many of these, Google started in the mid 90s, for instance, but they've also transitioned and become this new kind of, not quite a cartel, worse than a monopoly, in that the extent to which they can exercise control over the pieces of infrastructure that at the moment are essential for social media, commercial activity, finance. The information age, right? It's all absolutely interlocked. And obviously, as economists like Yanis Varoufakis argue, we're dealing with companies that are not simply private companies operating within markets, but that companies like Amazon, when you go on Amazon.com, you're not in a market anymore. You're effectively in a techno fief. You are sort of beholden, in a sense, to the law of the land on Amazon. So it'll be a much more destructive version if, as you say, these AI companies in the Great Lakes region, who once again are going to be using, in huge pieces of whether it's the public grid or
Mhm.
obviously of our shared lakes. There'll be a huge public dimension which won't really be addressed because we don't really know how to write, I would argue, partly the law for this, the regulation for
Right.
this, and we definitely don't have the politics for it either.
Right. Well, that's there's sort of a famous book that came out, I think maybe even 20 years ago, that's called sort of Who Owns the Sky, and it's about, there are these companies. I think their specific example is of things like airlines, right, which we are private companies, um, but basically use the real estate of the sky and destroy the ozone layer and do all these insane things that directly affect the public, and yet are not, it's not like they're sort of paying a dividend to society. I mean, they buy land from a city and then they build an airport, and then once the airport's paid for, it's, sort of pure profit. I mean, there's all these financial transactions and politics between maybe the airline companies and the airport itself, and the airport is sort of run by the city, by the state, all these things. But at a certain point, I mean, it's sort of a strange point, but things can only exist because the world sort of exists, and the world is determined. The existence of the world is sort of determined by everyone equally, and yet we don't really know how to assign responsibility, charge, earn, determine these things. But you think about, there's those videos that are people who live close to the data centers, who have no water pressure, who have massive sediment in their water, all of these things. I think it's easy if you're not directly affected by it to not really think about it. But there are sort of the really sort of primary impacts on people like that. And then there are things for us, which eventually, we talk about this, data centers may at a certain point basically be the size or bigger than cities. If you think that's not going to affect how much your water bill or your electricity bill or any of that stuff is, I think you're kind of mistaken.
I think in a world with AI, we just won't have bills. We won't have a normal monetary system or even an economy necessarily. And the question is, well, what will we have instead?
Mm.
What will we be doing instead? One of the issues, to your point about the world, is we don't have a concept of the world or a theory of the world. The truth is that, airplane companies do pay dividends. They pay dividends in terms of stock dividends.
Right.
And there's just not a lot that after a certain point I think we can do with stock dividends. And this is an important point as far as, what was the great technology of markets or the technology of financial materiality, the technology of something like a stock market? Well, look, it's a useful tool, and it was an extraordinary organizational tool. And if it was not for the internet and the transformation of human society through the internet, I don't think we would be having this conversation in quite the way that we are about markets and about, the old-fashioned way of a company coming in, whether it's building the copper mine, whether it's building the airport, and yes, okay, investing in schools around it, providing jobs. If you go and look at the political platforms, all the post-war political platforms, what are they? We're going to get the best deal. We're going to have, right, we're going to be able to negotiate and get some of the funding into the schools. We're going to get that water system finally fixed, paid for. In other words, government has this kind of mediatory role because it's trying to balance, right, the issues of these people who are public owners, so to speak, citizens of the city or the country, and the companies who want to come in and who are driven, right, by this, it's an old-fashioned phrase, captains of industry, right? We're going to develop like the public society in which the state or the city makes sense. So as far as industrialists are concerned, they're contributing the social contract on the basis of which you have something like national citizenship. And there is a fair bit of truth to that, but it's a kind of temporary fiction. And the internet has totally destabilized normal governance contracts. It's completely changed the meaning of what private ownership and market activity. Again, these tech companies are so big that they're kind of beyond regulation. And an interesting example again in the Great Lakes region, of course, is Microsoft, who have gone in and they're trying to resuscitate again, to treat the big tech companies as if they can give this older-fashioned industry meets the state and the people who labor contract. as if they can just have that. So what they're proposing is, what we're going to put money into STEM programs. They're even going to build a solar array, which can, when it's complete, power up to 500,000, 1 million homes. So they're trying to offset, in other words, the energy that they're going to take. But one sort of more devilish piece of ideology that they've introduced, beyond the fact that I think this entire paradigm just simply won't work, I think that AI will invalidate all naive economics that we've had up until this point, whether it's, again, wages or bills or even sort of basic concepts of affordability. But they also talk about a sort of perfect loop in terms of the water that they'll make use of. So obviously, fresh water specifically is used in artificial intelligence for cooling, and there's technology where you basically 100% of the water is returned. So unlike some of these data farms where the water evaporates and is kind of lost, Microsoft has the technology to put 100% of the water back where they found it. The problem, of course, and this is really, really important, is that there's a cost, though, in terms of the energy. That water, something happens to that water.
Mm-hmm.
And in this sense, it's not just about the water in the Great Lakes, and you've already mentioned this. It's about, what about the primary and secondary effects of the people around it, and what is this energy cost? What is it for? Why are we going to be powering or using the power equivalent of millions of homes so that people can use ChatGPT, so that people in the corporate world or in private finance can get it even, whatever they need, even quicker? Again, it's the ultimate speculative industry.
Mm-hmm.
Doing things quicker, cutting out red tape, cutting out roadblocks. Commercial activity will find itself unleashed, is the idea. Of course, what people underestimate is that unleashing artificial intelligence will kind of invalidate so much of the basic contracts that regulate commercial activity, that kind of make it make sense. And so it will be a very, very strange deal. And I think this attempt of Microsoft to be a good liberal company who still believe they can offer this contract to the 2,000 workers who will be hired, and the schools they'll invest in, and the revenue that they'll bring to the cities and the state itself. Yeah, this is the very contract they're in the process of invalidating. Also, a major story coming out of the United States is recently Harvard, just the last few days, Harvard has basically been told they cannot have international students.
Right.
And there's lots of legalese behind this, but it's part of already a variety of threats on which the Trump administration has acted on.
There's both the legalese and then the Trump all caps, Truth Social tweets about the countries that these students are coming from are not paying the U.S. any money, which they owe them for allowing their students to or their citizens to use the prestigious American schools and then return back home. And, it's sort of this weird inverted brain drain thing in his mind.
I don't think we should be too glib about the gap between the account that Trump gives and, the quote-unquote really existing situation on the ground. I'm not sure what the really existing situation is on the ground at Harvard or at Princeton or Ivy Leagues or universities in the United States generally. I think that's pretty much what's being debated. I think that, again, you have a sort of false opposition between the universities and the Trump administration, firstly. It's a false opposition in that it's actually more a conflict between the Trump administration and the governors of these universities, who believe that the university is an essential liberal institution. And the Trump administration, which has basically gone post-liberal, they're not interested in any of the contracts, the liberal contracts. They have certain fictions to do with patriotism and citizenship and definitely a firm belief in the power of markets and naive economics. But in that sense, they're no different from the university governors themselves, who are basically neoliberals, who operate great universities like Harvard and Princeton as effectively hedge funds. And it's important that we understand what that means. It means that Harvard is not really a university. Harvard is a sort of, a landlord, and it also runs a business, and it also has, a multi-billion-dollar endowment, and Harvard owns tons of assets. A recent story was that they discovered a more recent version of the Magna Carta, this famous political document, and this was one written about 50 years after the original Magna Carta itself, which was written in 1215. And, of course, the first thing they do is they go to Sotheby's, they go to an auction house, and they get it valued because that's the important thing we have. Because what they can put in their ledger is a plus 20 million, and this is what Harvard worries about. And this is something again that maybe Trump is not going to post on Truth Social. He's maybe not going to say, and also they're operating like a giant hedge fund.
Yeah.
Principally because Trump, while he might not want the financialist class as such to rule, he certainly does not want to tank the American economy. He simply wants to reshape it in his image, so to speak. And so he's not going to point out the hypocrisy as he sees it. But again, many people believe that it's this battle for between the Trump administration and Palestinians or pro-Palestinians, protesters or non-Americans, foreigners. I think this is where the gap is important between the narration that we get from the Trump administration and the debate going on about, well, what really even is Harvard? Is it this bastion of liberal democracy, or is it basically a glorified hedge fund?
Right.
And the importance is crucial because while the Trump administration relies upon these extreme tactics and an extreme narration about why they're doing what they're doing, and this is why, for me, the Trump administration fundamentally politically fails, is that even if you have interesting ideas about manufacturing, willing to take on radical ideas around devaluing the dollar, questioning fundamental axioms of the setup of the global economy, which of course the Americans are the crucial piece for. It's worth mentioning that even the sort of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, whom Trump disdains, is just a radical conservative when it comes to the possibility of anyone taking up the mantle in the way the Americans have, being, for instance, the reserve currency. For 60% of foreign currency reserves are in the U.S. dollar. Like, this is a huge responsibility. So while I can get behind questioning some of these axioms and trying to get back to some form of building, I think that using narrating it as a problem with immigrants or really believing there are these trade deficits, of course, is where you get a little bit of fabrication. But I don't think we should oppose it to people who go up blandly to Trump and say, oh, but there isn't really a trade deficit. Look, this is where the gap is important. The fact that there is a narration is ultimately, I think, what Trump does resuscitate. And this is politically important. We are going to have to narrate what happens in our societies. There's always going to be a certain gap between the narration and the quote-unquote concrete activity itself. And so while we might disagree with the specific narration, I think that we cannot go so far as to criticize narration itself or even fiction to an extent, nor should we ignore in what respect, any big criticism of the global political setup will have to come with a certain narrative. And we should absolutely, if anything, oppose any attempt to present American universities as if they're just these naive places of intellectual cooperation and collegiality.
Totally. Well, I was thinking it's very interesting because, I think a lot of sort of Trump supporters and literally people in like the Trump government, especially kind of like, the whatever 12-year-old Fortnite players they have running Doge or whatever it is, would almost want Harvard actually to be run like a business. I mean, they sort of want everything to be run like a business and optimized for markets. And so they almost would say, okay, yes, it's great. You're so prestigious. You have a copy of the Magna Carta. But what's really important is that you have $20 million in the bank that you could sell. And maybe you should actually sell it. It doesn't, it's some old thing that doesn't matter. I mean, they would be kind of caught in the middle of these two values. And then on the other end, and so of course they're going to criticize them, but they're not going to criticize them basically for the right reasons. And they can't, because they almost agree with the way that Harvard is run in a way. They almost think that, yes, okay, you have a surplus, you should invest in real estate and futures, and your pension fund should be tied up in the stock market and all these bets. I mean, they would basically advocate for this. This is how a business is run. Everything should become a hedge fund. Harvard now is. And then you also sort of have, the more sort of leftists, and oftentimes it's through the lens of pro-Palestine. You look at places like McGill here in Montreal, where there is kind of a constant stream of pro-Palestine protesters outside, critiquing the fact that McGill has these kind of intimate ties, literally like to the state of Israel, that they invest in not uncertain ways. I mean, that's the thing. You follow the paper trail, you literally find that they are tied to the state in these ways. Now, of course, their call is usually just sort of complete divestment, but we often don't call into question what does it mean. The fact that you I mean, you probably never could have, but you can't sort of have this naive, like, there is really a university that's an academy, institute of higher learning, that's this amazing democratic learning institution, and in fact, you need to have a hedge fund. It has to become a hedge fund. They literally basically could not divest from these things in this way if they wanted to and continue existing. It's just interesting to see the way that those two criticisms sort of manifest.
You're absolutely right. This is the conflict the left on campus does not want to face, that right now all of your nice, good liberal values are stabilized because of how Harvard or McGill or whomever chooses to operate in the context of markets and specifically in converting themselves into basically a financial institution. Anything can become a financial institution. A podcast can become a financial institution insofar as you own assets and are engaged in some form of trade on the financial basis of the assets that you own. So in other words, if you're not focusing on, say, industrialization, if you're not focusing on sort of bringing together the resources and the labor and the capital to engage in industrial production, you're engaged in some form of financialization. So what this means is that this conflict of, can you have a Harvard without, can you have your liberal values? Can you even have democracy without the present state of financial capitalism? The truth is no. And this is, again, where the value of narration becomes important. What is the story they want to tell? I mean, in this sense, the left has a preoccupation with objectivity, with what is really happening, as if they need to reassure themselves of certain certainties, and then they can build their emancipatory political project. But it won't happen that way. You're going to have to sort of, ironically, the left will have to act more like Trump in being willing to engage, not in fabrications, but let's say in fictions, which are sort of narrations, not just of what could be, but when you have a disagreement at the level of interpretation. Again, we can go around the block arguing all day about whether or not but really, Harvard still is a good democratic institution, a great university. And then someone will say, no, it's a hedge fund. And then someone else in the Trump administration will say, no, it's a giant factory for ideology. How do you cut across these radical ideological disagreements? That's where narration intervenes. That's where politics intervenes. And I think you made an excellent point as well when you said that you would think that the sort of Doge bros, however you want to describe them, would admire a university being a hedge fund. And this is an interesting point. I think one thing they don't like about Harvard and about the Ivy Leaguers and about, part of the sort of American university system, which again, I will say is not very leftist in its organization. There's something very leftist about being a hedge fund. But anyway, is that they don't like that they're a hedge fund plus, but they're using it to reinforce nonetheless certain liberal values. There's something very clearly about the Trump administration, which is post-liberal. And what this means is that they're not to be honest, it's an interesting and perhaps dangerous approach, that they're not interested necessarily in naive democracy or even in naive economics. It's uncertain what the final structure of Trump America will be when all of the liberal institutions have been torn down, whether it's healthcare and now higher education. What I don't think we should do, however, is react so aggressively to the breakdown of an order, namely the liberal order, which, again, much like Harvard's own composition and survival, itself is simply a way of maintaining a strong negotiating stance on the part of government and the citizenry with markets, with the movement of capital. There's one thing that is allowed to move freely in this world, and that's capital, in a way that nothing else can move. And therefore, states have to be arranged in such a way as to as to facilitate capital, to facilitate commercial activity. And the reality is there was a time when we could strike a good balance and we could get universities and we can get universal health care. We don't have that balance anymore. And Trump and his administration are obviously taking an aggressive stance on how to rebalance things. And it's not necessarily away from the ethos and even to an extent the structures of something like financial capitalism. But this rebalancing act is absolutely necessary, and it's not clear at all where the balance will be struck or how. Turning to this episode's last topic, and it's quite relevant in that, there is an attempt again, a counter-political attempt, you might say, against Trump and his administration and other administrations like Trump's on the part of governments like the European Union or in the European Union and to an extent the Canadian government, as far as, okay, well, maybe we can strike this balance and come up with a new form of global financial stability and global commercial stability without the Americans. In other words, we can save markets. And let's be very precise here. There's no question that the universities want this. The universities absolutely want to simply save good old-fashioned neoliberal stability, which they know means commercial stability. But recent comments from Energy Minister Tim Hodgson sort of indicate, in the context of the fossil fuel industry in Canada, sort of how this dynamic is playing out. And there's sort of a kind of alliance of basically fossil fuel companies in the oil sands, and Tim Hodgson sort of said basically, you're not moving quick enough with carbon capture. So this technology that will render the oil sands net zero by 2050. This is the sort of dream of people like Hodgson and people like Carney. In other words, he's upset that they're not moving quick enough for markets. That the big bet of the Carney administration and Hodgson sort of mandate as energy minister is to get this carbon capture technology up and running, prove that it can work at scale, which is a huge if, so as to signal to markets that the Canadian government is going to lead the charge on the energy transition, take advantage of the scarcity that the energy transition will implement, which Carney, right, ever the financier, as he argued throughout the whole election campaign, will increase the value of the remaining fossil fuels.
Right.
And finally, also, we will have clean fossil fuel energy. There's a mouthful, if ever there was one. And this, of course, is also something that Carney extensively petitioned for, this idea that we can have a clean fossil fuel industry, which will effectively allow us to set up new standards, effectively commercial standards, regulatory standards for global energy. This is the role that Canada wants to play right now. It's an uncertain role technologically, and it's this sort of, I think, very naive, kind of fantastical political counteroffensive. It's saying, we can just have good old-fashioned liberalism.
Right.
It's no different from Microsoft. Even a solar array is not going to fix the situation, because you're not going to get rid of the underlying breakdown of this old-fashioned contract of industrial and liberal negotiation between labor and capital. Because we just don't seem to have labor and capital in the normal way. We don't even have society set up in the normal way, that people are just working and collecting wages and paying into their pensions, and industry is simply moving along, building things normally and taking advantage of the opportunities. This is not the society in which we live. So trying, it's not unlike, Keir Starmer's kind of Brexit reversal from last week, in that the liberal order that does still exist is trying very hard to find a financial and commercial consensus, ostensibly without the American dollar, which seems like a total impossibility. Of course, I think that their underhand position is to continue negotiating with the Trump administration. But this is the sort of fantastical fairy tale counteroffensive of the liberal order right now, as we're seeing it in Canada and around the world.
This has been Radical Priorities, episode 29. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.